Tonight on a special edition of EWTN News Nightly. Power and unity through prayer. From the White House to Capitol Hill, a look back at the National Day of Prayer. Honoring D-Day. On the 75th anniversary of the Normandy landing, a World War II vet is laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. A letter to a suffering church. Bishop Robert Barron talks about the clergy sex abuse crisis. And the sound of music. The organist behind the heavenly tunes at Notre Dame Cathedral comes to Washington. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, July 4th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for this special July 4th edition of EWTN News Nightly. I'm Lauren Ashburn. We begin tonight with the National Day of Prayer. In May, President Donald Trump highlighted the administration's commitment to faith and life. In a Rose Garden event at the White House, the president promised to defend people of faith. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports.
And just today, we finalized new protections of conscience rights for physicians, pharmacists, nurses, teachers, students, and faith-based charities.
Today, the president also voiced support for faith-based adoption agencies that refuse to place children with same-sex couples. And he spoke again about his opposition to abortion.
Every child, born and unborn, is a sacred gift from God.
In the Rose Garden today, Father Charles Trujillos with the Catholic Information Center in Washington.
Dear Lord, help our country. Protect our people.
And Rabbi Yisrael Goldstein, injured days ago during the synagogue attack in California. He thanked President Trump for the phone call he received after the tragedy.
You were the first person who began my healing.
Did you have any words of advice for the president today about...
We asked Rabbi Goldstein what President Trump could do to help end the violence in houses of worship. The rabbi believes it starts with education, and he told the president a moment of silence is needed in public schools.
And was he supportive of that idea?
Very much.
President Trump also made several commitments at last year's National Day of Prayer.
I will soon be signing an executive order to create a faith initiative at the White House.
The initiative could help faith-based organizations receive federal funding.
God bless you. Thank you.
But the White House still hasn't named anyone to head the effort.
Why has a year passed and no one has been named to lead that office?
So that person's been identified, and we look forward to pushing that through here in the next few weeks. We're excited about that opportunity, and in the meantime, we've done a lot of the initiatives and efforts that office would take on through the Office of the Public Liaison.
The Trump administration also announced new rules this week for federal employees. The rules will make it easier for them to take off days for religious observances and holidays. Lauren?
White House correspondent Mark Irons. Thank you, Mark. Stay dry. And on Capitol Hill, a National Day of Prayer service takes place tonight inside Statuary Hall. Each chamber has its own official chaplain. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi takes us inside for a look. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. Yeah, the chaplain of the House and the chaplain of the Senate are both officers of Congress. They earn more than $150,000 a year. Now, the Senate is served by a Seventh-day Adventist, the House served by a Catholic priest. Today, I chatted with both of these chaplains.
Gracious God,
prayer in the heart of our nation's capital.
Help our senators to continue to seek you in prayer.
This is Congress's first order of business every single day. A 230-year tradition.
Benjamin Franklin in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention saw that they had reached an impasse and suggested that they pray.
And it was Benjamin Franklin who actually suggested maybe we should ask some help from God.
So I think given the adversarial nature, the give and take of the legislative process, I think our framers knew that we need a spiritual start.
Senate Chaplain Barry Black served as a missionary in Peru and was later chief of the Navy chaplains. He tells me there's good news in the midst of partisan Washington.
Each week, our lawmakers come together, 20 to 30 of them, for a prayer breakfast. And at the end of that prayer breakfast, they join hands, both sides of the aisle, and they pray together. They're saints in Caesar's household.
And from their offices in the heart of the Capitol, they've seen a lot of history, presidents, and the Pope.
I said, "Can I give you a blessing?" He said, "Si, Padre," and so I gave him a blessing.
House Chaplain Father Pat Conroy served in parishes and Jesuit schools. He says his ministry is often listening to representatives during votes.
I'm the one adult that they can just be themselves and talk about real human things, not the political.
He calls that an oasis for lawmakers.
May all that is done this day be for your greater honor and glory. Amen.
Our thanks to Mark Irons and Jason Calvi. Catholic dioceses all over the world are reeling from sexual abuse allegations against priests and other clergy members. In May, a prominent U.S. bishop told me that the way forward is to bond together, not pull apart. Joining me now by Skype is Bishop Robert Barron, author of the new book, Letter to a Suffering Church. A bishop speaks on the sexual abuse crisis. Bishop Barron is founder of the Word on Fire Catholic Ministries and auxiliary bishop for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. He writes the book in his own name and not as an official response. Your Excellency, welcome back to the broadcast.
Good to be on as always. Thanks for having me.
Why did you title the first chapter of your book, The Devil's Masterpiece?
I think first to highlight the spiritual dimension of the issue, and not to gainsay for a second that human cooperation was very much involved. It's not an either or, but to signal the spiritual dimension of it. And, from the beginning of this crisis, it's always struck me, it's just inadequate to explain this simply by appealing to, human psychology, human machinations. There's something that's just so perfect about the way this crisis has undermined the church. It reaffirmed my belief in a supernatural intelligence that is the enemy of the church. And I just think I agree very much with Pope Francis that to ignore that spiritual dimension is to ignore the key element here.
You said that it is just too exquisitely designed, which I thought was perfect. Your book also highlights St. Peter Damian, an 11th century saint who focused on wiping out sins by clergy members. So tell us the historical connection to today.
I just think it's a distant mirror, to use Barbara Tuchman's famous phrase. We look back at the 11th century and we see in Peter Damian's, cri de coeur, his cry from the heart about the way especially high churchmen were abusing their own spiritual sons. That's what strikes me so much as redolent of the McCarrick situation. And he refers to it as spiritual incest, which I thought was really an apt way to put it.
When and that's Theodore McCarrick, who was here at the Archdiocese of Washington and then was later defrocked with allegations of sexual abuse.
Exactly. But when you have spiritual fathers preying on their own spiritual sons, there's something especially nefarious about that. And I think Peter Damian's powerful cry from the 11th century is echoed in the hearts of a lot of Catholics today.
You say that you understand in your book, and I've heard you say it before, the frustration and anger of abuse survivors. Mm-hmm. You also say there's never a good reason to leave the church. Can you understand their position?
Sure, and that's a big part of the book. I mean, in some ways the book is poised between these two poles. The one is understanding fully the anguish and the frustration, the anger of Catholics. Look, I'm a bishop of the church. I spend a lot of my time going out among the people of God. As I say in the book, often clothed in the full liturgical regalia of a bishop. So there I am, beautifully symbolizing for people the church. I have heard this past, 9 months or so, the anguish and the anxiety and the anger of God's people. There's no question about it. And we can't deny it. We can't run from it. So all that's true. And I want to say it as powerfully as I can. At the same time, and to me, it's the most important line of the book, if you want. There's never a good reason to leave the church. Reason to be angry, reason to be frustrated, reason to call for change and reform, absolutely. But there's never a good reason to leave the source of salvation, to leave the mystical body of Christ. Instead, and this is my way of resolving that tension, it's the moment to stay and fight.
Oh, I was just going to say that. It is the
Go ahead.
time to stay and fight. I pulled it out too.
Very
We're going
well
to have
put,
to
I
leave
must
it
say.
there. Bishop Robert
Okay.
Barron, thank you so much. Founder of Word on Fire, Catholic Ministries, Auxiliary Bishop of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, and the author of Letter to a Suffering Church. Thank you, Bishop.
God bless you. Thanks.
Coming up, we'll talk about a poll about whether or not the American dream is alive and well. And we hear from World War II vets as the nation this year commemorated the 75th anniversary of D-Day. A poll released earlier this year says while the American dream is threatened, it's not dead yet. In a Real Clear opinion research survey of more than 2,000 Americans, 27% said for them personally, the American dream was alive and well. 37% said the American dream was alive but under threat. And 28% said the American dream is under threat. But there is hope. 7% said for them personally, the American dream is dead. Joining me now to take a look at the findings is Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief for Real Clear Politics. Carl, welcome back to our broadcast.
Thank you, Lauren.
For Catholics, let's talk about the breakout that you had. The number of respondents who said the American dream is alive and well was higher. It was 33% compared to the 27% that we just mentioned. Now, Tim Carney, I know you know who he is. He came on the broadcast last week. He wrote Alienated America, and he found that there's a strong corollary between communities that are centered around church and have a vibrant social community fabric, and those who think that the American dream is still alive.
Well, I don't want to shill for Tim's book, but I don't have one out myself.
Well, you did have one,
Well,
so you
but
could mention your old book.
No, I might.
Okay.
I might as well. You saw Rome with Catholics higher.
Yes.
Significantly
Right.
higher. Well, among people who go to church once a week, it's even more. It goes up to 37% of people who say the American dream is alive and well for me personally. People who go to church more than once a week. Now, you're talking essentially Roman Catholics and evangelical Protestants. 47%, really almost twice,
So
almost twice as many.
Interesting. So okay. Well, we'll tell Tim he was right according to your poll. But for this poll, you used Merriam-Webster's dictionary definition. I'm going to say what it is: happy way of living that can be achieved by anyone in the U.S., especially by working hard and becoming successful. So, what does it say that nearly 40% of those surveyed think it's under threat? Almost 10% think it's almost dead.
Well, you know, they've been subjected to a lot of bad news lately, a lot of, in this era that we're in, very partisan news. If you say things are okay, there's sort of a, our friends.
The news, yeah.
They're saying, oh, well, you're okay with Trump? I didn't say that. I said I would believe in the American dream.
Right.
But there's a lot going on. And also, we're still at war. We still have these troops. I mean, for people to say that it's under stress is okay.
Right.
That makes some sense.
Right. But the dead part?
To me, that's Nowheresville. But look, those are people, 7%. That's not big in our country. It's alarming to me because it's obviously not dead.
Right.
But that definition you mentioned, can. If you work hard, you can get it. It doesn't guarantee anything.
Right.
And some of that 7%, I think, are people who've been raised maybe on the left to think that the American dream, there's a myth there that people do work hard and don't get ahead. So there's a lot going on in their minds.
One other statistic, 41% Democrats, and you say that, your report says that the Democratic primary electorate is not as far left as once thought to be, but the right is characterizing the left right now in the positions held by Democrats as coming close to socialism. So how do you reconcile those two messages?
Well, you remember the old bumper sticker, if you had a conservative friend, or maybe you yourself, Lauren, had this, annoy a liberal, work hard and be happy. Well, so that was a stereotype. But if you look at this poll done by John Della Volpe, Real Clear Politics poll, it's not that simple. Urban people in urban areas, which voted Democratic, tend to believe more in the American dream. Some of the people being left behind are not just leftists, not just immigrants who had a tough, some of them are people in these Rust Belt states. I was looking at this poll today and I was reminded that Make America Great Again, that word again is important. We tend to forget it. Make America Great. And some of these people, because small towns and rural areas didn't score as high on this as people in urban areas. And that makes me think some of these people who voted for the president felt, as we knew they did in these Rust Belt states, left behind, and that the American dream for them, it's not that it's dead, but it's under stress.
All right, thank you so much, Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief for Real Clear Politics. Thanks for joining us.
Anytime.
On June 6th, world leaders gathered in Normandy, France to commemorate 75 years since the D-Day invasion. It was the largest air and sea invasion in history, involving around 160,000 troops. At Arlington National Cemetery, a family buried their father, who stormed that same beach in the second wave. White House correspondent Mark Irons shares their story.
His first step on Normandy Beach was on some young man's chest.
Sergeant Carl Mann and his brother soldiers flooded the beaches of Normandy in a fight for freedom.
He was on the second wave, 10 feet behind the first wave, and most of those guys didn't make it in the first wave.
Now the Catholic decorated D-Day vet is laid to rest here among fellow heroes. Two of his sons, Carl II and Miles, say he never forgot those who paid the ultimate price.
He would tell you the heroes were those friends he left behind.
He would say, talk about them, not him.
What he experienced on that beach followed him forever. He came back home and got married. He and his wife Dolores raised 7 kids.
When you spent any time with him, you knew you were important.
27 years ago, one of Carl's sons, Gordon, was ordained a priest. He battled cancer, and Father Gordon Mann passed away earlier this year, a month before his dad died. In the Mann family, God came first, a lesson that came from the top.
Dad's the first one to teach me about Jesus.
He taught me how to pray. He instilled that in all 7 of us kids.
And on the battlefield,
he would share Christ with his brothers who were dying.
Carl left behind brothers on that beach in Normandy, where a major piece of his life was formed.
He never got off of that beach until, as I was able to tell him as he was passing, whispered down in his ear, I said, well, you're finally getting off the beach.
Well, he sounds like he was an amazing man. EWTN News Nightly talked to other veterans who served in World War II. And tonight, Wyatt Goolsbee shares their stories and sacrifices they made for our freedom.
They should never forget what these guys did. It was amazing. It took guys in 8 and 10 weeks to put them in the front lines, and they fought. They were just good guys. You know, they did the job.
Oh, say, can you see? We met David Sunnig and his fellow veterans at the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. The monument features an inscription dedicated to D-Day.
You know, to endure such a traumatic event in their life at such an early age and to survive and to help see the liberation of Europe, that is absolutely worth celebrating and worth remembering.
Joe Davis speaks for the veterans of foreign wars. He praises the troops who fought for freedom on D-Day and beyond.
That greatest generation, they became the politicians and the scientists and the poets, and, you know, they became the captains of industry that allowed America to flourish so much in the second half of the past century.
Well, I think basically what they need to know is to appreciate, you know, the suffering and what they contributed to preserve, you know, the freedoms, you know, in our country.
Color guard, retire the colors.
George Hoganson and George Cridland say their generation is passing away, but others will follow in their footsteps.
They should appreciate and understand the most wonderful nation in the world, and that's the United States of America. A lot of blood's been spilled by brave men to keep it that way, and I know they'll carry the torch. It's not just a one-time thing.
In Washington, Wyatt Goolsbee, EWTN News Nightly.
Up next, a look at a group of students and their project on a priest and martyr, and one-on-one with the Notre Dame Cathedral organist. A runaway slave turned Catholic priest is one step closer to sainthood. Father Augustus Tilton would be the first African-American saint. In June, Pope Francis recognized Tilton's heroic virtue, leaving him 2 steps from sainthood. A school project about another priest on the way to sainthood was on display in our nation's capital last month. It was part of a national scholarship contest, and correspondent Jason spent time with Catholic students from Oklahoma.
A special delivery from Oklahoma to the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. These students beat out 500,000 American students, winning one of 50 spots. One exhibit for each state. It's part of the National History Day competition.
I'm not familiar with Stanley Holman. Who
Rother. The first mystery is how to pronounce his name. How in the world do I pronounce his name?
Stanley Rother.
Rother. Father Stanley Rother.
I stopped because I saw a topic of something I've never heard of before, someone I'm not familiar with.
Now, Blessed Stanley Rother. He's one step away from sainthood.
That would be awesome.
It's no wonder George Washington's on display here at the American History Museum. But for one day and one day alone, Father Rother gets a special honor just about 100 feet from where I'm standing.
The Oklahoman farm boy, ordained a priest, served as a missionary in war-torn Guatemala.
He actually did the right thing. He translated the New Testament into Zutujil, which is the native language of the Aztecs down in Guatemala. He helped people. He built houses, expanded churches.
Doing that led to death threats. He returned to the United States.
He was very courageous. He went after Guatemala, he came back to Oklahoma, but he was like, I can't leave them. Like, they're my family too. And he was very courageous, and he loved them so much, and he put like their needs before his own. And I really want to be like that.
3 men killed Rother in July 1981.
When he died, so many Guatemalans wanted to become like him, so they became priests themselves.
The church officially declared him a martyr, which led to his beatification in 2017.
Blessed Stanley Rother, pray for us.
The Owen kids were there, sparking their interest in researching this priest.
If you do the right thing, you can reap rewards greater than you can ever imagine.
And on one day, he could be known around the world as Saint Stanley.
I believe he's a saint in every way.
In Washington, Jason Calvi, EWTN News Nightly.
Finally tonight, the organist who played inside Notre Dame when the cathedral caught fire says he's thankful for the outpouring of support from around the world. Johann Vexo came to Washington, D.C. in April for a concert to raise money for his cathedral. And that cathedral burned April 15th. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby talked to the musician at the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception.
Johann Vexo is praising the heavens in the same way he's done most of his life, by playing the pipe organ.
We can express different feelings with such an instrument, with very soft sounds, for example, as well as very powerful sounds.
He's performed extensively throughout Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and Russia. This week, he's here in the United States. It was just a week ago Vexo was inside the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, playing the organ during Mass, when he heard an alarm.
Nobody was really worried or concerned about what was happening. We all thought that it was just like a dysfunction or a mistake.
But it wasn't a mistake. No one inside the church realized by the time they left, a fire on the roof grew larger and larger. Vexo, like so many Parisians, watched the cathedral burn for hours.
We all were very devastated after.
A bright spot for the cathedral's choir, the organ survived the fire.
The organ is apparently undamaged. We still have to switch it on to make sure that everything is okay, but the organ is still there.
There is a lot of work to do inside Notre Dame, but Vexo feels more optimistic about the future. Monsignor Walter Rossi, the rector of the Basilica, says the church is happy to welcome Vexo to perform with the choir Basilica. He says it's important the Basilica here in the U.S. support the Catholic community in France.
Notre Dame is our older sister. They're 800 years old, we're 100 years old, and we're both Marian shrines, Marian places of devotion. And so when tragedy strikes in any family reach out to help.
Catholics pray family and faith will give strength to Vexo and the Notre Dame community.
Our thanks to Wyatt Goolsby, and our thanks to you for tuning in tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Lauren Ashburn. I'm going to go celebrate my birthday now. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night, and God bless you.